Keep in touch with the Wolf Connection Podcast on our Instagram handle at the Wolf Connection Pod, or email us your questions, comments, and guest ideas to podcast@wolfconnection.org. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection Podcast. I'm your host, John Kaufman. So this has been a podcast in the making for quite some time. He is a busy individual, so you can all understand why. We've gotten some great feedback when we posted that he was coming on with us. So people have shared personal stories of interacting with this individual and just how wonderful he is. He is a former wildlife biologist, and since 2014, he has been a conservation filmmaker, photographer, educator, and all of those wonderful things. Ronan Donovan, coming to us from Bozeman, Montana. Ronan, how are you? It's a pleasure to finally meet you and get this going. Yeah. How are you, my friend?
Oh, doing great, John. Thanks for that stellar intro. I'm happy to be on here with both of you. I've listened to many of your episodes and really happy with the work that you're doing. It's just so important to be able to gather these voices together and for a common good. So happy to be on. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we appreciate that, man. Thank you so much. And I mean, let's jump right into it. I mean, how did this journey start for you? Because again, going from biology to photography, filmmaking, and storytelling, really on such a deep level, where was that for you as a younger individual? Was that something in your bones as a child, or where did this biology route come from, and then eventually get into what you're doing now?
Yeah, I grew up in rural Vermont, and my parents were very intentional in how they raised my brother and I. We grew up on 25 acres that was raw land that my dad and mom cleared, and they built a small house on that property. And our childhood, my brother and I, was all about just being outside. That was our fun zone. That was our happy place. If we had a rough day at school or something, we'd go outside and go explore. And we had to walk 1.5 miles to the bus stop and along the creek and through the woods. And my parents I think they'd give us a ride if it was below zero. That was the deal. But that was, it was these kind of adventures to and from school that we'd have every day. My parents were both educators, teachers, so they would, keep these journals of what we saw going for walks. And my mom would teach us the local birds, and we would draw all the animals we saw and kind of keep these journals. So it's very, I look back on that, and it's kind of similar to what I do now as a biologist and then a photographer. Go out in the wild and record what I see, take notes, and then share it. So so that was kind of the impetus for finding the natural world to be a place that both inspired me, but also is a place that I still go to recharge. And so it's the kind of passion, the dedication, and the inspiration came from that childhood. And then I was I was a rowdy kid. I didn't fit well into kind of the seat in classrooms. So I would be like all over the place, super energetic, ADHD, just like banging off the walls, basically. And I got into trouble when I was 13. I got a couple felonies and 4 misdemeanors. I started stealing stuff, and it was kind of a way to impress this wrong group of friends. I was trying to find my place in that community. And I mean, this is small town Norwich, Vermont. This is not like crime doesn't happen. So it was very easy when people started reporting things missing from their vehicles. My buddy and I would steal stuff from vehicles, and shotgun was one of the things we stole. It was a felony. And then my parents, they had recently gotten divorced, and they were having their own challenges in the struggles of life. And here I was, just a big bomb and all of that. And so they kind of went back to the core and sent me out to a emotional growth camp in Bend, Oregon, when I was 13. And so I went out there for 1 month, kind of this intensive program where you do a bunch of physical hiking with a group of other troublemakers and rebel rousers. And then you have a solo for a week, and then you do an intensive kind of with a guided facilitator who was one of the co-founders of this program, you sit in a circle for a week, and he kind of basically just like breaks everybody down. Like, what's your motivation? Where you want to be? And are you there? Like, do you all want to be here? Do you want to, not be in control of your life? So that was one of these big turning points for me. A lot of it surrounded the natural world. I was taken out of my place. I was put into this wilderness in Eastern Oregon. And then I came back and, went to reform school for a year, made it through high school, made it through college. And then I actually almost went into like a business environment. I studied international business and economics at University of New Hampshire, and then graduated with a Bachelor of Science in International Business and Economics with a minor in environmental conservation. Actually interviewed for 2 jobs in Boston with John Hancock Mutual Funds, and left both interviews thinking there is no way that I could do that job. And everyone's like, oh, it's great entry level, in 10 years it'd be all set up. And I have friends that have gone that route, and yeah, they're doing great and they're super happy in the place. But for me, it was no way. I returned. I bought a brown suit from JCPenney's or something like that, and returned it like immediately after the interviews.
I love it.
And yeah, I kind of like had to figure out back to the kind of intuitive path that I really wanted in life, and found an internship doing spotted owl work in Yosemite National Park. And that was this, another one of these big kind of spark events in my life. It was both photography and then the field research came together. I bought a film camera before I went out there and just started full throttle, just like obsessed with photography. It fit well with my active mind, technical elements of it I enjoy. And then being out with these really talented biologists. The team I was with was fantastic. We were doing work for a PhD student. So we were kind of the field technicians gathering the data, monitoring spotted owls in these old growth forests of Yosemite. I mean, it was just, wow, it was incredible. So yeah, that's a long answer to kind of how it got started, but that's it. And that's,
wow, really interesting. So wait, so how do you go from buying a suit at JCPenney's to go to a business interview where you're likely going to be in some office to interning on some project that is studying owls? I mean, there has to be some story or some transitioning point from there, because that's a wild transition point. And before that, was there any ounce of you that was interested in photography, or that came after the owl research? It was kind of like the next logical step to furthering research and furthering your experience in studying owls.
The transition kind of from like, potential business job to the owl internship. I did start out at university with wildlife management degree. Like that was the major I chose. So I had that in mind, and intuitively that's what I want to do. And then what we were doing in class was kind of these like environmental impact assessments surrounding some business. You'd go in and do a survey ahead of a mine or ahead of a development. And I got more interested. The initial kind of interest was like, well, what's capitalism? What's business? I'd like to learn more about that. My dad was a business consultant, and not that I had any idea what that meant, but that was what he did for his second career after being a teacher. And so I went through university and then traveled. I went to New Zealand, studied abroad there for 6 months, and became very disillusioned with capitalism and the idea of, just the current state of economics and perpetual growth model that is not sustainable, and there's no natural system that supports it. And that's what our economics is built on, is perpetual growth. And so I was very suspect of the business world, and thought I'd entertain it and see what that was like. I don't like cities. I don't like being in those environments. So it was very jarring, the idea of like going to Boston and I got blisters on my feet because I had to wear these dumb shoes, and it was like, well, it's loud and smelly, and it's just a jarring environment for a rural kid who was born at home. And grew up outside. And so, pushed up against it, said no, was offered both jobs, said no. And then I ended up sleeping on the floor of my two college roommates. They had an apartment in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And one of them's like, yeah, I know a guy who works in like the lobster industry, like doing like wholesale lobster work. And I said, sure, I just need to do anything. I did, carpentry through high school and summers, and I like working hard. So that wasn't a big deal. And so I, spent 6 or 7 months working in this lobster industry. And that was, we were wholesalers. So we would buy from lobstermen and then just repackage and distribute. And, it was fine, good group of people. I didn't want to do that forever. And a friend of mine out of college started working for this group called the Student Conservation Association. And they're based in New Hampshire, and they do some cool stuff all around the country, mostly with like high school trail crew placement. High schoolers who want to go to a national park and work on a trail with a team for a month or so. And I'd never heard of them. My buddy was like, yeah, well, they have a bunch of internships, post-college or throughout college. And you could do regional, and I'd been to the West. My dad brought me to the Wind River Mountains and the Beartooth Mountains in Montana, Wyoming when I was a kid. Went to like a camp in Colorado. So I had this idea that there's this whole other wild place out there to the West. And once you become ecologically minded, you start to think a lot differently about the east of the Mississippi kind of landscape that's been like completely manufactured and changed by colonial humans, logged 2 or 3 times at least, and plowed and all the things, and pacified with people and predators and all that. So the West was a place I wanted to explore and be in. And so I found this job and internship in Yosemite and applied for it, and ended up doing 2 summers there with the spotted owl work. And photography, to your second question, I took a black and white class in high school, but I look at those pictures and it was just like random stuff, like my friends and like the school I was at a reform
a bicycle.
And, yeah, just like
a lot of
totally icicles. Yeah, lots of that. I was interested in photography, but had no idea what that meant. I had a little point and shoot camera. I took pictures at like parties and when I traveled in New Zealand, and but no, there was like no thought to most of it. It was just kind of like, yeah, this is interesting. But yeah, it wasn't until going to Yosemite. I mean, also there's, the Ansel Adams Gallery in the valley. There's professional photographers that are there. It was kind of this like awakening of like, oh, this is actually a thing that people do, that are exposed to. I grew up on National Geographic magazines, like a lot of people of my generation and before, and I understood the power of it. I loved sitting down with those magazines. I have them all in my house now, that I had when I grew up, and I had the idea of photography as something that I enjoy, but I had no idea what that meant, and so going to Yosemite was kind of the start of that.
Man, that's incredible. I mean, when you talk about this stuff, because we were emailing back and forth, you and I, and before we were setting this up, and you do the work with the spotted owls, and then you go across the pond there, the ocean, and you get into Africa, and you're studying chimpanzees, and then wolves after that. Why? What was the impetus, or what was the itch to make that huge leap to go and do that work? We've talked to a couple of folks who went. Joanna Lambert particularly sticks out, that she, primates, chimpanzees, and then wolves are really back and forth. What was it about both of those, chimps first, I guess? What got you into studying that, particularly in those places, and then for you to come back and then start your work with wolves?
Researching chimps was another of these kind of big turning points. I've mentioned a few of them already, but they're really important. And I think if we have them in our lives, and this was one that was very obvious to me, where I lived in Uganda for a year with my partner at the time. And it was the first time that I had been immersed in the day-to-day lives of wild animals. And these are research chimps in a place called Kibale National Park. They're wild. They've been studied for 30 plus years. When I was there, they're still studied. So they're completely habituated, used to human presence. You could follow them every day for weeks and months at a time, and that's what people do, and that's what people have done for decades there. And what that means is basically you can be within 20 or 30 feet of this family of chimps, and there were about 54 individuals in this community. And chimps are fission fusion, which is a term that's similar to humans, where we have our like core nuclear family, let's say, but then we have our extended family, and we're generally never all together at the same time. We have our small groups and nuclear families together, and then maybe we'll get together in groups of 10, 15, 20, let's say, or like a big family reunion would be like a unique thing for humans where everyone gets together. And it's like that with chimps. So there's 54 in this community, but they're never all together. It's groups of 5 to 10 to 15 to 20, depending on the food source and what they're up to. But it's this opportunity, both like the day-to-day rhythm of, I lived inside the national park, and so you wake up and you don't have to get in a vehicle. The forest is literally 20 feet from your back door, and you head into the forest at night with a headlamp, and there's forest elephants that you got to listen for and watch out for. And you could be by yourself, or you could be with a group of people that are other researchers that are going in. And you go to the place where you left the chimps the night before. They make a nest in the trees every evening, a new place, and they sleep in a nest in the tree as a group. With females will have multiple years of young, they'll have a baby, and they'll have a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, and they'll have maybe a 10-year-old, and they'll all kind of be close together. Sometimes they share nests. And the sun starts to rise, and they start to come down and start their day, and you follow them, and you have no idea what the day is going to hold. It's different all the time, and they mirror the human social structure and behavioral structures very similarly. They have hierarchy, they have politics, they have leaders, they have follows, they have tool use, they have culture, they hunt, they have fun, they play a lot. There's individuals that are traumatized. There are animals that are healthier than others. There's healthy leaders, there's unhealthy leaders. Like, it's this whole saga that's happening in the wild. And it was this just absolutely eye-opening. I'm totally blown away by everything that I saw there. And doing that day after day for months and months, you start to think about their lives. You start to empathize with them much more than you would if you just saw a picture of them. And they have names for research purposes. And so you're talking to other researchers about what happened today between Kakama and Eslam, and there was a dispute, and there was a fight that went on, and you become these observers to their lives. And there's no interaction. We're not touching them. There's no feeding. We're just kind of these weird bald apes that walk around and follow them and have stuff and backpacks and clipboards and all that. And during that year, you understand individuals. It happened quicker than I thought. Like, at first, people were helping me, of course, understand like which individuals are which, to recognize them. To me, they all look the same. There were size differences, male, female, sure, but how am I going to tell the difference in their name? And after a couple of weeks and maybe a month, it was like you'd see the corner of Johnny going into the bushes, and you'd be like, oh, that was Johnny's shoulder. Like, you start to pick up on these things in a way that I think we do with humans very well. We have very high facial recognition, just like chimps do. We have to be able to discern very quickly, are we a safe human or a safe chimp, or is that an enemy chimp? You have to understand individuals very quickly. And you start to understand these individuals and their life histories. They're all recorded. And there was a handful of these chimps that had suffered these pretty severe snare injuries from snares that were set by villagers that live alongside the forest, who used to have access to the forest, and hunting and trapping is part of their heritage and culture. And they're not targeting chimps, they're targeting bush pigs, these small deer species, dikers, bush bucks. But the chimps, inevitably, the young ones especially, could and would get caught in their wire snares, most of them. And pretty horrific stuff. There was one chimp that lost both his feet in two separate incidents. At one point I wasn't there for it, but the researchers who had been there told me he was carrying his foot around. It was still attached by a tendon, and like pretty awful graphic stuff that was happening kind of in this, this passive way where they're not being targeted, but they're really directly being affected. And Max, to the amazement of everybody, and to, just how testament to how robust chimps are in terms of their immune system and fighting off infection, he survived both of these incidents, and is like an adult chimp. Like I saw him a few years ago when I was there last. His locomotion, his stumps have calloused over, and he can move and he can climb, and he can do most chimp things. He's actually reared offspring, which is that's pretty much the goal for an animal. And so despite all of that, he's been able to persevere. And it was, to me, it became hard to be a researcher and just to be focused on, the research elements that are valuable, and I find them to be valuable. And that's what I was doing there. But at the same time, I was like, how can I continue to just do research while the animals that I'm researching are suffering at the hands of humans, directly or indirectly? And, it's a kind of an island national park in a lot of ways, where it's, there's a very hard edge between the human world and the national park. And so, human population growth is a huge factor in this area around Kibale National Park in Western Uganda. It's a big challenge in the future with, the human population around in Uganda is just going to triple in the next 50 years. And that's a huge issue with resources. And so photography had been developing the whole time throughout the years of doing spotted owl stuff or doing stuff in Montana for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And then I was actually using photography as a research tool to study the chimps. I was taking pictures and video of their behaviors. And so I started to want to do more in the education, outreach, kind of advocacy space, and using photography as that tool started to look more and more like the avenue that I wanted to take. And so, that was 2011 when I was in Kibale National Park, and sent some pictures. The professor that I was working for, he knew a National Geographic photographer named Tim Lehman. He sent Tim some of my pictures I was climbing the trees in the national park, the fruiting trees. The professor had asked me to do that. So I'd be up in these fig trees where the chimps would visit, and kind of looking down on them or at the same level. And it was this very different view of their day-to-day lives. And they spend, 2/3 of their life, let's say, up in the trees. And those pictures were interesting to Tim Lehman, who's wonderful. I just talked to him a few days ago. He's still a mentor and friend. And he was very kind in sending me the email address of the natural history editor at National Geographic magazine at the time, named Kathy Moran, who I worked with on all my stories for years. She just recently retired, but he said, Kathy's very busy, referred by Tim Lehman in the subject header, 2-sentence email, attach your best 2 photos and a link to 30 other photos, and then just wait. And so Tim gave me kind of the blueprint, and I did that. And you could imagine how long I obsessed over a 2-sentence email. Probably took me a week to actually send it, and sent it off. And then, I had to wait, months and months went by. And eventually Kathy replied and was very interested and wanted to see more. And I uploaded another 400 photos, and she made an edit. And eventually we met in person. This was a couple of years later. I met her in person, and then tried to get on. She wanted me to assist some photographers and tried to set that up. Joel Sartori was the first, and he had pitched a story about the Javan rhino. It fell through. And then, I was kind of just in the orbit, no work for National Geographic, wanting to do that, still doing science work. And then there was this big Yellowstone project for National Geographic that went on for a couple of years. And early on, maybe 6 months in, there's a photographer named Nick Nichols, who was somebody that I looked up to for my childhood. He did a lot of stories on chimpanzees and gorillas, elephants and lions. And so he was a larger than life figure in many ways. And his assistant went on a different project. And so he needed an assistant kind of fast. He was already in Yellowstone, already living in Mammoth, the headquarters there. And so Kathy said that I'm going to go and have a first date, 2-week contract is what I signed first, just because I never met Nick. And so I went there, and yeah, that turned into like a 1.5 year long contract working in Yellowstone. And so I was there just to assist Nick, and mostly doing camera trap stuff. And so we worked closely with a lot of the large carnivore biologists, Kerry Gunther with the grizzly bear team, and then Doug Smith and his team with the wolf project. And there was another photographer that was initially assigned to do the wolf work. And they moved him off the project after about 7 or 8 months. Just wasn't the right fit. And so they had this vacancy where they needed somebody to try to get some natural history wolf stuff in Yellowstone, and then kind of embed with the wolf project team when they were doing collaring operations, and they're doing den surveys and all these kind of just their protocols, doing cluster searches. And so Nick was like, they were looking at other options, because I wasn't the wolf guy. I wasn't, I had seen wolves a few times. I wasn't this animal that I necessarily had any excitement over other animals. I was into social animals with chimps, and wolves are another social animal, and grew up with dogs, and have that kind of connection that a lot of people do. But it wasn't until Nick said, like, look, you're young and cheap and here, why don't, he's asked Kathy Moran, the others at National Geographic, why don't you just let Ronan try, give him a chance. He's eager. And so that was the start of the wolf work.
So wow, that's amazing, man. Love stories like this. So like you said, you're saying you weren't the wolf guy at the time. So how did you approach, what was your first, what were the first actions you took to kind of put yourself in position to get good pictures of wolves, which are notoriously already hard to photograph?
Yeah, it was a lot of trial and error. First I went to Doug Smith and Dan Stadler and Kira Cassidy and worked with them. And basically, they were great in that they, Doug has instilled in all of people that work for him this kind of importance in the science communication and education and outreach. And it's something that I really respect about Doug and the whole team. They're all really great at it. Dan Stadler, Aaron Stadler, Kira Cassidy, and Kira's sister Brenna Cassidy, they're all fantastic at the science communication. And so they were great. The higher ups of the Park Service told the higher ups at Yellowstone to, open the doors to National Geographic. And so Nick had this, ability to set camera traps, and they extended it to me. And then they shared a lot of information. They were very helpful in, some of the recent wolf activity, or if they were, certain, they have collars and they have GPS points and they have these things that are very helpful. And they were, but wolves are really hard to take pictures of in Yellowstone because they're still hunted and trapped along the border. They do collaring operations every year, and that's an intense human interaction. So the wolves are wary of humans, and they should be. It's a good thing. And then you can't legally get within 300 feet of a wolf in Yellowstone by Park Service rules, which is another really hard thing. In photography, generally, we work to the animal's comfort zone. It's our job, or if we're working with a new animal, we have a specialist with us that can help read the signs if it's a complex social animal or a predator or something, where it's like, okay, we're okay here, but we can't get closer. And that's how we normally work. You generally try to get as close as possible. There's some sayings of, with photography is if your pictures aren't interesting, then get closer. And so that's hard in Yellowstone, and for good reason. And so I tried in the beginning with a lot of camera traps in certain places. We had very special permitting to be able to use camera traps that, had special rules. You couldn't be in view of the public, and it couldn't be on trails. And so, maybe trying to find some carcasses or some game trails to take pictures. But wolves are wary of human things. So, the original camera traps, or a lot of them have like lights flash that go off, and it's kind of these big systems. And I set out one of those, and it was just like I got a picture of a scared wolf, and that's not useful, not appropriate, not ethical, like all the wrong things. And so I was like, okay, well, this doesn't work. And it was probably, I was probably 3 or 4 months into the assignment, and it's my big break essentially. And so that's my life. I'm not doing anything else. I'm living in Mammoth at the headquarters with Nick and his wife in park housing, and I'm going out every day. And then, winter study starts, where the Wolf Project does an intensive month long, and they do 2 months total in the winter. So there's a lot of eyes on the ground, which is helpful. And, and also photographing there, like some of the research. So they were doing these collaring operations. And so made a couple pictures there. There's like a picture of a Doug Smith hanging out of a helicopter, getting ready to dart a wolf in Yellowstone. And that was one that the editors at National Geographic were excited about. That was kind of my first kind of breakthrough picture, where they're like, okay, this is useful. We'll publish this. But we still didn't have really much wolf behavior. And so, that's what you really need to bring people in and to show, an animal without the kind of human hand, which is hard to do in Yellowstone. And so, like, all the best pictures I made during that, it was a year basically of trying, was in like a 2.5, 3 week period in March, when the Park Service basically gave Nick and I like administrative access to Hayden Valley. So like there was a low snow year that winter. And so park employees and service and law enforcement and stuff can access interior roads if they're snow free, when it's not open to the public. So it wasn't open to the public for another month or more. And so they said, yeah, you can, go in there. And there was a couple bison carcasses bison had fallen through the ice on the Yellowstone River, south of Hayden Valley. And their carcasses floated up in kind of this like shoal area, this shallow area. And so they were kind of this scene where there was, 4 or 5 carcasses in that little cluster. And they're grizzly bears. The males wake up earlier these days. There's more food on the landscape in Yellowstone, and they can take over wolf kills if they happen to find them. But in this case, these were, drowned bison carcasses. There was 5 or 6 grizzlies that were moving in and out of the area. They would kind of wade out or swim out and pull these carcasses ashore. And then there was the Molly's wolf pack was using that area a lot as well. And then this wolf, 755M, Mr. Blue was his nickname. He was just starting to set up the Wapiti Lake pack with a female who, it was just the two of them, and they were running around in Hayden Valley. And so I started bumping into them and the Molly's pack. And then some of these images started to come that were really, like, the hard part about photographing Yellowstone is just that that wolves are shy, and they should be. There's good rules for not getting close to the animals. And then there's just like a lot of people too. So it's like, I've been on safari in Africa where you can drive right up to the lions. You can drive right up to hyenas, and there's a leopard in a tree, and you're right there. And you can basically, there's no, distance rules. And so it's kind of tricky when coming to Yellowstone. There's a lot of people think like, oh, you can do that in Yellowstone. You can get close. You can do, work to the animal's comfort zone. And you really can't. So it all just like it always does on assignments. It comes down to just like the right lucky situations and just being there. And that's what happened.
How did your perception, if there ever was one prior to, how did this all evolve for you in terms of wolves? Because like you say, it's interesting that you worked with both two social animals, group pack type animals, community type animals with chimpanzees and now wolves in that first experience. And then it obviously, the domino effect starts after that, because you work on Kingdom of the White Wolf, you have Yellowstone Wolf Dynasty. What was the thing that captured you with the wolf from this point on, and the perception you had now going forward that this was going to be one of your main sources of education and information as you make these films?
The benefit of social mammals is that they're relatable to humans. Reptiles, amphibians, insects, they're amazing and important and beautiful, but they can be more challenging in some ways. There's the term a lot of people have heard, the charismatic megafauna, where it's like these are big animals that are, whales and dolphins and orcas and wolves and grizzly bears. They're things that are relatable. They're mammals, so right away we can relate to them in a different way than we can with other animals. But then the social dynamics, where there's all the things I mentioned that chimps have in their behavior and their culture and social groups, so it becomes this really valuable entry point. And the more I learned about wolves, the more conversations I had with people like Doug Smith and Kira and Cassidy in the field. You start to understand that there's the natural history, the science, and the behavioral aspect of wolves that is very compelling and interesting. That you have to, they're territorial social animals like we are. They hunt the same things we do. They have to work together to defend territory and to take down animals that weigh 5 to 10 times their body weight. And they're not very good hunters in the end. Like, they fail most of the time. And the numbers game is what they're going for. Numbers of interactions and then numbers of individuals. Like, they want to have big packs. That's the goal. And so there's that kind of behavioral side that's very intriguing and very relatable and speaks to the human interests. But then there's the whole management side of wolves, and wolves existing on the human dominated landscape, and what's called the social carrying capacity of humans. What level of animal wildness, landscape wildness do modern humans tolerate? And that's what conservation is moving forward, is just managing humans. It's nothing to do with animals usually. It's just about what's the human tolerance for this, and how much conflict is there and challenges, and what's what misinformation is there, and does our land use structure set up conflict, or does it set up for coexistence? And most of the North American, the colonial European model is set up for conflict with weeds, with insects, and with wolves. And so it clicked quickly and easily for me, the realization that wolves become this incredible entry point, as you guys know, to have wider discussions about conservation, landscape, the human interaction with wildlife, and what the future can hold between this kind of intact, biodiverse landscapes compared to what we've done in the past, where we've, clean slate, nothing allowed to live. And we still do that with agriculture. I mean, we, round up ready corn or soy. It's like you kill everything in the soil that exists, and then you plant seeds that are genetically modified, and then you put fertilizer on top, and then you spray with herbicide. And that's the only thing that grows, is the thing that you want. And so wolves push up against that model, and they push up against the idea of the fully human controlled landscape and these manicured landscapes. And so that was kind of the switch for me to realize that, it's not about the animal specifically. It's about kind of the idea, and people, we have a lot of ideas about them. We have a lot of historical kind of folklore about them as well. So yeah, they're a complex animal, as you guys know.
Yeah, I was about to ask you. So you obviously now you know as much as anyone, but was there a moment that something occurred where you switched from a guy who's trying to break into the industry of photography, wildlife photography, and then actually realizing the level of tension that exists around the topic of wolves, just socially, particularly in this country, but really in a lot of different countries. What did you always know that existed? Or, I mean, because obviously with chimps, I'm sure it's equal. Maybe I don't know about equally contentious in the same way, but in different ways, it's equally contentious. On the continent of Africa, was there a moment when you realized, like, wow, this is more than this particular species is about more than just wildlife or just conservation? It has this incredibly complex and really deep and polarizing social implication.
I remember, I think it was 2017, maybe. There was this wolf in Yellowstone. They called her the White Lady. She was the Canyon alpha female. And she was shot just outside of Gardner, Montana. She was shot inside the park by a poacher, somebody who was probably on their way to work, potentially heading north from Gardner towards up Paradise Valley, towards Livingston. There's an area near the runway and the dump in like a little like recycling dump facility where you could drive down and be right across the Yellowstone River and be maybe 200 yards away. And they shot her, in the shoulder, fatal, or wasn't fatal. They ended up having to euthanize her. The Park Service did. They found her alive. Some hikers found her, and then the Park Service put her down. And that was a wolf that, they never collared her. She was turned pure white. Her and her mate had the longest pair bond recorded. I think it was 6 or 7 years. And it's a wolf that should have lived her whole life inside Yellowstone National Park, and she did most of the time. And she was inside the park when she was shot. And, I came from Africa and came from, Uganda, and, they have a lot of challenges there. Like I mentioned with the chimps, they have poaching and they have the border issues and, land disputes. And I was kind of naively thinking like, oh, well, that stuff doesn't really happen in the United States. Yellowstone, the world's first national park. And, spending that year and a half embedded in Yellowstone and learning about all the issues around the park and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, it's this irony that Yellowstone's the first national park. It's currently at its best in terms of the biodiversity and the health of the landscape in many ways. That all the animals that were there when the park was created are there and in abundance, more than they were when it was created. There's still, the human use and indigenous element that is not corrected yet in terms of access and use inside the park. But while it's at this kind of, wildlife natural abundance state, there are still these massive challenges around the park. Bison movement, elk movement, disease issues that are misguided and pushed onto bison, even though it's elk. And then there's wolves and grizzly bears and cougars. And so it's, it became this very apparent, challenge that still exists. And there's still a great need for, for us to try to figure out ways that we can both coexist in the landscape with wild nature, but also, use the landscape in some form, the idea of like true wilderness where things are and nobody goes there. And there's not a lot of that has existed in the past. And so it's kind of this new thing that we're trying to figure out.
So when you kind of came to terms with the idea you're describing right now, did that at all change your mind about obviously purpose is wrong because the purpose of art is completely subjective, but to you personally, did that change for you the purpose of photography, the purpose of filmmaking, your intention for it going forward, or did that change anything for you really to come to that conclusion? Or were you already kind of on that page before, just not in this particular context?
I was already steered a little bit in that direction, having transitioned out of just the pure research into, communicating science and education. I mean, photography to me is like, it's just the tool that I use. and I use a lot of tools. Like I use film, I'll use photography. There's a museum exhibit now. I organize panel discussions and do lecture series around the country. So, I've always been kind of mission driven in the sense of like trying to promote forward thinking and coexistence practices and positive change in terms of, the human interaction with wildlife. And so, wolves just kind of, that just pushed it into I think a whole nother gear, because it's, I live in Montana. I interact with a lot of people who are, excited about wolves, people who are not excited about wolves, people who have conflict with wolves in livestock sense, people who hunt wolves. Like I interact with all these people. Many of them are friends, many of them are colleagues that I've worked with over the years. And so it's the subject that I probably know the most about in comparison, like to the chimps, or I did a story on mountain gorillas. That was just a few months in Rwanda. But, compared to the other projects I work on, I know the most about the wolf issue, and have tried to, educate myself further and continue to do so, and have ongoing projects, and will probably always work in that space in some form or another.
You have this incredible quote on your website, which it's from the nature writer Barry Lopez. It says, "Throughout the centuries, we have projected onto the wolf the qualities we most despise and fear in ourselves." Why that quote, and what does that mean to you in terms of the storytelling that you try to impart on people?
That's an important quote for the work that I do, and Lopez in general. His work greatly informs a lot of what I do and how I think, and I revisit his work often. And that quote specifically, there's a lot of terms that get thrown around that related to wolves. They're killers, they're demons, they have bloodlust, they sport kills, that they're ruining the landscape, that they're, putting the cattle industry under, that there's all these kind of like superlatives in terms of the, people that don't want wolves to have free range. And basically all of those are just reflections of what we have done and what we do continually. I mean, it's like we raise livestock to be killed. Hunters kill, a lot, tens of thousands more animals per year than wolves do. There's just this, it's kind of just this rhetoric. And so it's really easy to kind of create these kind of tribalism divisions between both humans and other humans, but with humans and other animals, and especially the animals that mirror us in so many ways. And wolves are those animals. So it's, they evolved on the same landscape, hunt the same thing. And then, ironically, we domesticated them first as for any other animal. So it's, the projection that we have, humans do it with other humans very quickly as well. We call other humans animals when we want to dominate them and we want to take over their place. I mean, this stuff's happening now, this language in warfare. And it's similarly with wolves, in the sense that we want to demonize them. We want them to be less, we want them to be subhuman. So it makes it easier to do what you want to them in the camp of some people.
Yeah. I mean, this whole thing is certainly filled with irony that just compounds as we continue to explore wolf and human, the wolf connection, really, the wolf and human connection. But so back to a little more of like a technical space. So you were working on capturing photos of wolves in Yellowstone, already a hard thing to do, as you mentioned, and now you're filming in the Arctic, the kingdom of the white wolf. I mean, that seems like it's got to be double, triple as difficult when you're filming animals on a landscape like this. It's essentially tundra, right? It's wide open, probably few rock formations to conceal yourself. I mean, how do you set up for this kind of shoot? And are you just sitting still all day hoping to not move wolves out of the area? So at this point, I mean, that has to be an element when you're fully exposed. But how does that look? How do you put yourself in a position to capture these particular wolves, and how maybe is it different from your Yellowstone experience?
It's very, very different from the Yellowstone experience in a lot of ways. I was first brought up to Ellesmere Island with Kira Cassidy and a BBC film crew team that was 2016. And so there were 4 of us total. These are the wolves that Dave Meach had visited with and studied for, I think he did 24, 25 visits, something like that. Jim Brandenburg famously photographed them for a few National Geographic magazine articles in the late 80s. And it's mind-boggling when you arrive, and we arrived, long transport to get there. And then eventually there's a helicopter that drops us off at a known wolf den site. At that time, Dan McNulty had taken over for Dave Meach and had a couple callers. And so he knew where there were a few dens. And so the helicopter's landing, and there's 2 yearling wolves that start running to visit the helicopter, which is, again, the opposite of what happens anywhere else in the world, or, in Yellowstone. So the helicopter's touching down. Kira and I are getting dropped off. We're throwing bags out. And this wolf, one of them sniffing the tail rotor, a moving tail rotor of the helicopter. She was fine. And then the other one, this yearling male, is like sniffing our bags and is like wants to steal steal something. And so we're kind of like having to excuse me, could you yes, we're here to see you, but not this close, kind of a thing. And, they kind of checked us out for a little bit. Helicopter took off. I remember the 2 of us just looking at each other and just giggling. Kira had been there before, and she kind of knew what it was like. But for me, it was just complete mind expansion. One of these another big of these kind of pivotal moments in my life, shifting perspective of what's possible, in these landscapes, in these situations. So that's kind of the entry point that I had in 2016. 2018 was much bigger. I kind of learned a lot from 2016. And one of the things that I wanted to do was be able to follow the wolves when they hunted. In 2016, we were just based at a den near one den. They moved the pups 1.5 miles, 2 miles away. So we were kind of back and forth, but base camp basically. And we weren't set up to follow the wolves. We did a few times, tried, but it's just there was some tricky high water, get stuck in quicksandy kind of stuff, and then not having enough fuel and small ATVs, and just kind of this whole challenge to it. And so I kind of dreamed up this next phase of that, and pitched it to National Geographic, and the magazine and television got on board. And so in 2018, that was, going up, I did 3 months, myself and 2 other guys, and embedded eventually with this pack of wolves that I've seen on and off for the last 5 years. I was just there again this past year, this summer. We called them the Polygon Pack, named after this kind of physical landscape feature. And it was like the chimps. It was basically, the wolves have never had any reason to fear humans. They do see people passively at a weather station, so they can choose to interact with the human world and see people. They're not fed, they're not provisioned, but there's lots of stuff to pee on at the weather station. There's lots of interesting smells, and then they'll see people sometimes, and they'll see vehicles, and there's planes that land, and there's this whole kind of human base that they can see and interact with if they choose. Most of the wolves are miles and miles. The Polygon Pack is 20 miles away, let's say, from that area, so they have their own kind of little private valley. But so that enables you basically, you show up, I'm on an ATV, and they'll surround you. They're curious. The surrounding thing, I've had it happen 100 times or so now with this pack, and it's the first 2 times you're like, whoa, like I've heard about this. Like this is, this is going to be a Timmy Treadwell moment. I don't want this to happen. And then suddenly you realize that everything they're doing and their whole behavior is just related to play, and they want to steal stuff from you. And they took a camera a few times, and I mean, if anything's loose, they're getting it. And just want to grab it. And then if they're by themselves or there's just a few of them, they need you to participate. They need you to chase, or else the game is not fun. We've all done this with dogs. And I had this one situation where it was one of the first encounters with the Polygon pack. And this female Bright Eyes, I called her, she darted in and she stole a big camera, it was a Canon 1DX Mark III or 4 or something.
Oh, no.
It was right at my foot, and it was National Geographic loaned camera. It's not mine. I need that camera to keep taking pictures. And I had another camera in hand, so she grabs it and runs off, and I'm instinctively just like run after her, and not ever going to catch a wolf. And then I realize, I get a couple, I get 30, 40 feet, and I'm like, oh yeah, I know this game. So I stop, turn around, and start like walking away, like I'm not interested. And she stops, turns around, and starts following me, still with the camera in her mouth, because the game isn't fun if you're not being pursued. And then I quickly turn, clap my hands, and yell, and it startles her, and she drops the camera. And then I'm able to get it. So that's the level of kind of the upfront difference between wolves in Yellowstone and wolves in the Arctic. And what I've started to think about in relation to, why that is, why the wolves are like that there, or what's unique about it, is I've started to think about it as like a step back in time when humans and wolves existed in the same landscape, and they weren't in direct competition in terms of, with livestock, it's just we're raising prey, and we're raising really easy prey. We've dumbed down sheep and we've dumbed down cattle to be easier for us as humans to handle them, and it makes them easy in all the ways. And in the Arctic, there's tons of oral history of this for indigenous groups around the northern hemisphere that saw wolves as companions, as brothers, as deities in the landscape that existed, not in terms of a fear-driven motivation, not in terms of competition, but something to learn from and to see. And you can see that immediately with this behavior in the Arctic, where the wolves, the upright human posture, it's this weird kooky thing in the landscape that benefits us greatly to be bipedal and to seem like we're bold. And so the wolves, in general, they don't see us throughout history in general as prey. There have been lots of people that have been killed by wolves in Europe and Asia over the years. There still are some people every year in parts of Asia, 1 or 2 people. But a lot of times that is like in Europe, Barry Lopez does a huge thing about this, and of wolves and men, but a lot of rabid wolves that would result in deaths, or a lot of crossbred, hybridized wolves that were bred with domestic dogs that makes them less fearful and makes them bigger a lot of times too, in the case of European wolves that aren't as big. The northern hemisphere wolves, but these wolves, I've spent, probably 6 months with them, total, like nearly every day, and have never had any encounter with them where I thought that I was in danger, that there was never been any like nipping, that they were trying to hurt me. Everything is curious. I've fallen asleep and woken up to them pulling my hat off because they want to steal it from me. I've been on, near carcasses with them, been around, the whole family, the pups and everything. And plenty of situations where I've had much sketchier situations with domestic dogs over the years than I have with the wolves on Ellesmere.
Is that something that you incorporate? Because again, you talk about the education part of it, which, you were at a Storyteller Summit in 2020. We're going to get to the High Desert Museum, which I highly recommend anybody who's in Bend, Oregon, please go see that and bring the exhibit here, Ronan, whenever you get a chance. But talking about the domestic dog and the wolf situation there, do you ever impart that information, or how do you impart that information in any of these situations, whether it's in passive, in past talking, in a summit, in a museum type setting? What I think this information is very important for people to understand is that there are a lot more, actually by multiples, domesticated dogs, are more dangerous to a degree for humans than wolves are. What's your angle, and how do you impart that information to people so that they take away what you're hoping they take away from it in learning that information, and then being able to pass it along maybe to others?
I think about the wolves, especially in the Arctic, that I've engaged with as, offering up this opportunity to for me and for other people to better understand kind of the idea of domestication. It's the Western-minded people, myself as included, being from, the United States and being of, European descent. Like, the idea of domestication, had no clue how that was ever possible. Read some abstracts about it. So this idea, it happened maybe like this one specific moment that happened where somebody found a wolf pup in Eurasia 20, 30,000 years ago, and boom, we have a dog. And then and everything came from that. And when you go to the Arctic, you realize that domestication happened thousands of times. And you read oral history, it was not this one thing that happened and that was where we get all dogs. There's a great story of wolves and men from Blackfeet tribe just north near Glacier National Park, where a couple of young guys found a wolf den that had flooded and all the pups were dead except for one, and they brought one home, and then they raised it, and they had all these adventures with it for a few years, and then it went off and became a wolf again. That's something that has happened thousands of times, likely over the years. Over the tens of thousands of years. And so that's kind of the entry point that I bring to discussions about, the challenge of this fear of wolves, because, they do have capacity, and a lot of animals have capacity, and most animals, and even people that we don't know very much about, we can be scared of them if they have capacity. 300-pound 6'8" guy walks into a room and everyone's like, whoa, like that's a large human that has capacity. And then you start to talk to them and they're like a big teddy bear, and then you're disarmed. And it's similarly with predators, where most of the time people don't see predators. They don't interact with them. They don't see cougars. They don't see grizzly bears. They don't see wolves. The things they hear about them, let's say with grizzly bears, is they hear bad stuff. They hear an attack. They hear somebody got fatally injured and mauled. And then generally they don't hear the backstory of like, oh, that person was running with earbuds and they didn't hear, and they ran into a female that was on a carcass that probably gave warning and had cubs nearby. And the person, so there's a lot of backstory to the human interactions with animals, and the fear around wolves, it makes sense in a lot of ways. Historically, if people were, most of the time it was kids that were out with livestock. So small people out in Europe and Asia that were kind of the shepherds looking after things. And, people got in situations where wolves can attack, and it's challenging. And in North America, we haven't had very many. We've had, less than 10 in the last 100 years in North America, fatal encounters with wolves. Some of those are still questionable whether or not it was wolves or bears or something else. But it's, any wolf that was aggressive in North America, and that is lethally removed generally. And that has been true for many centuries here with European arrival. And so the work that I do, most of it is, when I bring stories from the Arctic, it's essentially trying to debunk the idea that we should be terrified of wolves, because the wolves that aren't scared of people should be the ones that would, attack or do great harm. And so that's kind of like that's kind of the entry point that I bring. And I have, videos showing, wolves trying to steal, I'm sleeping on a pad and wolves trying to steal the pad underneath me. It's like, and it's standing over me, and it's not, it had just eaten. It's at a carcass. It's not hungry. It's not trying to eat me. All the behavior, once it's explained and you see the video, it's like, oh, it's just trying to steal the corner of my foam pad that is accessible to it in some way. And basically I just told, I talked it down. I just like sternly, the animals understand how, they're not pretending like these animals are trained or that they have an idea what I'm saying, but they understand that there's tone and movement, and sometimes you do have to like take space from them and push them out of situations if they're trying to steal your stuff in a way that isn't ideal. But yeah, it is hard to push through the fear. Like, people should be scared of wolves. That's not a bad thing. But to be scared of them in the way of like, when they reintroduced Mexican gray wolves in Arizona and New Mexico, they put these like kid-proof bus stops in because they thought that wolves were going to like snatch kids at bus stops. And so they had these like fenced in bus stops, and that hasn't happened and is very unlikely to happen. But it's it's still like, I was just in Bend for the opening of this wolf exhibit and having conversations with professionals there, and wolf biologist Aaron Bott, who is one of the state's wolf biologists. He's fantastic, and he's talking about the challenge now is in and around Bend, that there's a lot of recreating that happens. It's a much denser population than Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, and there's people that are pro environment and conservation and pro wolf, but then they're like, there was a video of a woman feeding a wolf a sandwich, and so getting into the stage where he's like, I don't want to tell people to be scared of wolves, but at the same time, it's like there has to be some understanding of respect. Like you should be a little bit scared of wolves in the sense that, in the same way that don't get close to an elk, don't get close to bison, have some education and awareness. And then I never thought that the mantra of fed bear is a dead bear. That's something that we've heard in terms of black bears and grizzly bears getting into garbage and trying to promote clean practices. I never thought that it'd be like a fed wolf is a dead wolf. Like, I didn't think that we'd be getting into that realm, but that's kind of part of the need for education and outreach. And it's just, to remind people that you gotta give some space to animals.
Yeah. When you're describing it, it's like I'm equating it to weather to some degree, and that, you shouldn't become, we're not going to become hermits locked up in our homes because snow happens or wind or strong winds happen or rain happens or inclement weather. But you should have a healthy fear of weather in general. It's part of what makes the natural world beautiful and magical and mystical, but also what makes it dangerous is that it exists, but it's also like part of the reason we as people who love the outdoors go outside. But you should have a healthy fear of it at the same time. So it's not the type of fear that's like, like you said, wolves are just going to be snatching kids off of buses as they exit buses. But you absolutely should have healthy fear of any wild animal. Any wild animal you can be in conflict with almost any wild animal. So really, what you're saying is, it fully resonates. And you got to be right. Now I'm watching your videos and I have to comment on one of them, but you've got to be right that these particular wolves could be mirroring more so than wolves in the American West, which we're in really close quarters with and we're constantly in conflict with. That these wolves may be mirroring a little bit better our early relationships with this species, and that is really wild to think about. And your story about the camera reminds me of a saying we utter frequently at Wolf Connection, which is to be boring, right? When the energy starts to get high and you're being messed with, because they mess with you sometimes, you're being messed with, just be boring. And it genuinely works. It's an oversimplification, but it genuinely works. But this clip that I'm watching, dude, I was watching it while you were talking. I don't know if you saw my eyes go like this, but it's mind blowing. This is it's one of the most unique clips I've ever seen. It's a herd of Arctic hare, which I didn't know existed. And there's a wolf chasing this herd of white hare. And my brain immediately said, like, dude, that has to be mountain goats. That makes no sense. And then you shot a close up, and I'm like, that is legitimately a herd of white Arctic hare. I mean, I did not know this dynamic was a thing. So herds of hare being hunted by wolves, was that a regular occurrence you saw, or was this like a special moment, or how did this happen? Because that's bizarre.
It is totally bizarre. Yeah, it's quite a surprise to me as well when I first encountered this. A herd of hares can be called like a husk or a down or a drove or something like that. But a herd of hares sounds better to me. That's kind of how I always remember it.
Yeah, it does.
Other real terms, but yeah. So these are Arctic hares, and they can weigh 10 to almost 15 pounds sometimes. So they're a very big hare, and the young are born kind of grayish. They look kind of like a rabbit would, hare would, and then the adults turn white and they stay white, which is kind of interesting in winter. So they stick out on the landscape. But the wolves will go out and target hares to hunt. And towards the end of the year, in the fall and early winter, in September, they start to group up into these husks or these herds, and they can be in the hundreds. And it's safety in numbers. It's like this swarm mentality that they're trying to do with the wolves, and they're much faster. In that clip, they totally outpaced the wolves, and they were running uphill. And it was this interesting day. That was part of this day. It was the longest follow that I've done with wolves. It was a 65-mile day over the course of 2 days, and the matriarch had disappeared, and so the wolves were kind of in this who's leading and trying to find food and where should we go kind of phase. And they were really hungry and were desperate trying to find some food. And they were trying to catch these hares, which is a lot of energy to expend, but low risk compared to a muskox hunt. And so they caught two, maybe an hour or two before that clip. And then following them into the mountains. And the hares I found would often be higher up in elevations during the summer. And the wolves knew that. And so when they would kind of go, like they would go up into the mountains, and there's no muskox up there generally. And so they would be going up to hunt hares. And I actually was keyed into the wolves, saw them first. It's kind of a little bit of snow in the landscape, and the hares are white. I was with Bright Eyes, who was kind of one of the best huntresses they had. And she just froze and was looking up onto the hillside, maybe a mile away. And the other wolves keyed into it. And then they did this like amazing, the wolves fanned out kind of formation where Bright Eyes went one way, Gray Mane went another way, Slenderfoot was a sister to Gray Mane. They all kind of went together. And then they were creeping for maybe a half mile before they started to whatever cued it in. And they looked to Bright Eyes probably to hit the dead sprint to try to ambush them. But they had this pretty amazing strategy that I was surprised they did, and they were unsuccessful.
This is bizarre. You guys have to look at this clip. When you first start watching it, if you didn't know, now you know it's a herd of hare. Whatever that, I've never even heard of that. Yeah. But now that you know what it is, but when you first watch it, it's just your brain is like, what am I even looking at here? Because there's no way that's 100 hare together just running away from this wolf. I've never seen that in my life. It's a beautiful clip, and it's so bizarre in the absolute coolest way. This has to be like one of a few clips of this.
It's a cool one. There's another clip that's better. That is from, I think it's called Hostile Planet, that I think Nat Geo did it. Yeah, it's a series called Hostile Planet.
I think so.
There was a team on Ellesmere that was in February, March of actually that same year that I was there in 2018. And they filmed it's winter, it's -30. And it looks crazy. It's crazy. It's filmed much better. It's beautiful. There's all these heat waves and crazy looking light and steam coming off of the hares, and the wolves hunting them in the background. Yeah. There's a cameraman named Rolf Steinman, that filmed that. And he's great. So yeah, it's a cool clip.
I watched this. It's actually, if anybody's got Disney Plus, it's on subscription there. I actually, now that you said that, I remember watching all of these episodes and how I remember that.
Did you see this clip though, John?
I did. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It's wild.
Everybody's scroll down to you will see a white wolf clearly getting hit by some hard wind, and behind that wolf is it looks like it's a bunch of shadows, but it looks to be a group of muskox. And that's right crazy. Next to that is the clip of this herd of hare. I mean, it's one of the coolest things I've ever seen.
We're gonna have to start that hashtag herd of hare for this episode. That's gonna be something there. It's crazy. I mean, what's the best part for you now, Ronan? Because you have all this stuff at your disposal, or all these avenues, really. And I want to say stuff, these avenues, because you, like you say, you have the museum, you have the Hiders Museum now. Which just when we wrap up, I just want everybody to know like how long that's in Bend for. But you have your filmmaking, your photography, you have all these different these summits, storytelling. What's it? Is the sky the limit for you? How do you feel in this moment for yourself about where you're able to go, do the things you need to do, and spread the information you need to spread right now in 2023 for you, coming from where you came from?
I think that a lot of what I'm moving into now is, I'm trying to piece together all that I have learned from social animals that I've spent time with. So wolves, chimpanzees, mountain gorillas are the three that I've spent the most time with. And, I've started to understand that most, if not all, the challenges that are arising now in relation to, let's say, wolves and humans, the dynamic, a lot of it is just related to like human health. Like, are we in our societies and in our communication, in our cooperation, are we as resourced and balanced as possible? There's a lot of scenarios that I've seen around the world and playing out around where I live, where specific individual people can make amazing progress and change because of who they are, because of like who they are at their core, how respectful they are, how graceful they are, and how well they communicate. Like these like really powerful leaders. And that there's a lot of barrier people that push up against that. Oftentimes there's a lot of just challenge that people have. You can see in the NGO world where there's egos that get involved, or you see it in some of the rural livestock areas where there's some really wonderful, healthy people that are working towards regenerative agriculture. And then there's some people that are, really under-resourced and having a tough time. Alcoholism is a real thing that is challenging. And I bumped into that a lot in rural areas where working on wolf landscapes and working in these places. So it seems like, wolves are kind of the top level, having conversations about wolves and landscape, but then at the root of that, it's like, do people feel like they have their needs met, their basic needs met? A lot of the like wolf conflict is in the West is rooted in like the geography. It's high, it's dry, and then it's rooted in the economics that that people have to force this economy onto a landscape. Nobody alive today created the situation that we all inherited in terms of the land use, in terms of economics, in terms of politics, and that starting there as the entry point of like, hey, none of us created this. Let's figure out how to create something that we all want moving forward that benefits everybody.
So, sorry, John, I just got a.
Go ahead.
But right when we started, I posted on our story asking for questions if anyone had any particular questions for you. And one of our listeners, his name is Vince. He does have a question for you, and I think it could be interpreted in two ways, and maybe we'll talk about both. But his question is, if you could lead a group of advocates, what would you start with to save apex predators? And that can be interpreted in two ways, I think, which is like, what do you think the most impactful effort would be, or what would you specifically, using your strengths, the things that you are passionate about, the things that you are strong in doing, in this case, photography, conservation, education, filming, all these things. What would you focus on if you had the backing of a group of advocates ready to do whatever the first thing is, whatever the first initiative is, what would you focus on first to save apex predators? And in this case, I guess we could talk about wolves, unless there is an umbrella answer.
If there was an umbrella answer, it would be focused on two things. One, you have to create core habitat, which means you have biodiversity, you have prey, you have everything that those animals evolved to need. You have those places available so that they have the option to exist. And then the second thing would be to resource the people that are directly affected by these animals. And I think that's something that can be challenging, and certainly in kind of the wolf world, it's easy for us in the kind of advocacy for, lowering conflict and promoting coexistence, easy for us to exist in kind of these echo chambers where, I talk a lot to warm crowds, people that are like excited about wolves, but are not day-to-day affected by them. So, again, kind of back to that, my previous kind of commentary about like the geography, the landscape, the economics. So people that are affected by wolves, people that, do lose livestock, and that's a real challenge that can be for certain people, to make sure that those people have the resources that they need to feel like they can be more creative in how they engage with livestock and how they raise these animals on a landscape that, is challenged. Like you bring a Eurasian species, sheep, cattle, goats, and you put them on the landscape in the dry West. That's a hard thing to do right from the start. And there are people who are, Cameron Krebs is a livestock grower, 5th generation Oregon livestock grower, sheep and cattle. He was on the panel discussion I organized at the High Desert Museum a couple of weeks ago. And he's this really exciting next generation. He's my age, probably around 40. And he comes right out and says, I can't do what my grandfather did. I have to change. I have to be creative. I have to be curious. And he comes at coexistence not because he wants to specifically coexist, but say with wolves and predators. He comes at it from an economic standpoint. He says, wolves are here, cougars are here, bears are here, coyotes are here. I don't want to be at war with the landscape all the time. And I'm going to try every tool that I have available. I'm going to night pen my sheep. I'm going to have shepherds that stay with them. I'm going to have multiple breeds of guard dogs. I'm going to try all these different things, fox lights. I'm going to try, whatever I need. And ultimately, what he comes back to is just raising the healthiest animals on the landscape. So making sure they have all the minerals they need, making sure they're not sick, making sure there's no foot rot in cattle, making sure that he's moving them into areas where the grass is going to regrow the next year, or let that pasture sit for a few years if it needs to. I mean, just coming at it from this creative way. And I think that if people, I know when I've been under-resourced or when I've been, challenged or depressed, I can't be creative. I'm in a place where I get tunnel vision, and it's like, this is the only thing that I can do, and focus on that and get obsessive. And a lot of that has happened, it seems like, with wolves. And it's not all the time. Like, these things are changing. Like, Wyoming is an interesting place. They have very little tolerance for wolves in a lot of ways in terms of keeping the numbers really low. But they were very against wolves being reintroduced. The relisting and delisting of wolves happened a number of times because Wyoming put them directly onto the vermin list as soon as they were delisted. And that was litigated. And so this has been 10, 15 years ago now. And yes, Wyoming still has majority of the state, 80% of it is wolves are on the vermin list, and they're, not able to disperse. And that's why they're reintroducing wolves into Colorado. But that, 20% that has wolves, and the wolves that they manage very heavily, a lot of people aren't complaining about wolves in the same way that they used to. They hold meetings, and the wolf specialist there, Ken Mills, I've had him on panel discussion before as well in Jackson. he says it's kind of interesting, like not as many people or not a lot of people at all are showing up to some of these meetings that would have been packed in the past. And so just the idea of like tolerance and consistency, I would love to see, and a lot of people would just love to see more wolves, let's say, in Wyoming, and have them have a little bit more tolerance and leeway to move into other parts and repopulate areas where there is a healthy elk population that they could subsist on. But there's a lot of like time and trust building that needs to take place directly with those people who are on the ground and who, at the end of the day, have a rifle and can decide what lives and dies. And so, the two things, having wild landscapes where predators can exist, and then making sure that the people that actually live alongside them, not people that live in urban centers. I live in town, so I'm not one of those people. I don't live alongside wolves, but making sure that those people are as resourced as they need to be, and allow them to be creative.
I mean, these are all points that we try to hammer home, and you said it better than probably we could have in that way. But yeah, it's a lot of what we talk about as the radical middle, is that there needs to be talking and voices have to be heard from all sides, and that we need to make these decisions and discussions together in a progressive manner that moves the conversation forward and we don't move it backward. I love that you said that with the rancher that was on your panel in the High Desert Museum. And he's like, and he's right. And again, I don't come from ranching or cattle grazing, any of that stuff, but times have changed from 20 years ago, 50, 100 years ago. None of this stuff is the same. And the landscapes certainly aren't the same. And the tools shouldn't be the same. And if we all want these things to work and coexist and to be managed correctly, we have to give the resources. And I think that's what I applaud Colorado for, at least right now, is they have that license plate program. I'm sure there's other monies that are flowing towards the people on the Western Slope that are getting the wolves reintroduced. So if you buy the wolf license plate, all that funding goes towards non-lethal measures. It gives the ranching community, it gives the people on those places, a non-lethal deterrence for wolves if they have a ranch or things like that. And those are the kinds of things we need to concede, and we need to help each other out. And I think that's, if we could have a coalition of people who are necessarily not thrilled with wolves and people who are thrilled with wolves come together and find these things in the middle, boy, it could be a really powerful movement, and it would just really make things so much easier for all this stuff to exist and to work. Ronan, just for everybody who've listened, and again, we can't thank you for giving us a huge chunk of your time and for just talking to us about all this. Just tell everybody where they can talk about the High Desert Museum in Bend, how long that's running for, what people can expect when they go to see that, and then where people can go to find the rest of your work, your photographs. What are the best places for them to find all that wonderful stuff?
Sure. Thanks, John. There's a museum exhibit called Wolves, and it's at the High Desert Museum in Bend, Oregon. Lovely place, lovely people that work there. I just did a whole series of programming a couple weeks ago, and they also have rehab animals that are there, and animals that are education animals, otters and some eagles and a talkative raven, and then they have there's this exhibit there, and it's comparing wolf populations in human-dominated landscape around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and then kind of that step back in time with images from the Arctic. And so that is at Bend until February 11th. And then it is staying in Oregon for pretty much all of 2024. It will go next to Eugene. The university there has a natural history museum. Open there, I don't have the exact date yet, but it's sometime in March. And then it is going to Portland, Oregon. After that, I think it's supposed to open in September. early September there. So yeah, it'll be an exhibit that's in Oregon for the next year, basically.
Okay.
And then
Awesome.
in terms of finding more of my work, Kingdom of the White Wolf is a great place to start. It's a 3-part series on Disney Plus I made for National Geographic Wild, with a great team of people as well. And yeah, it's great for kids. It's one of the best things I love about it is all this feedback I get from young people and these 5-6-year-olds that are in love with White Scarf and bright eyes and all these characters from the North. And then if you want to Google my name, Ronan Donovan, there's a lot that'll come up there, resources. But
I mean, listen, we're gonna have all of the links in the description, so you guys, everybody who's listening, can see all of Ronan's work. My last question for you, Ronan, is when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
I knew this question was coming too. I'll say creativity.
It's shown in everything that you've done, the creativity and your journey. And man, it's really been a thrill to have you. And you're welcome back anytime. Anything that comes out, you let us know, and you're welcome back on the podcast. But Ronan Donovan, thank you for everything that you've done, that you continue to do.
Yeah, thank you.
And just for your plight for education around these animals. Really appreciate you.
Likewise to both of you. Thanks so much for spending time, John and Stephen. And to your little one, Stephen, there. Hello.
He likes to come in at the very end and
nice.
See everyone.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys.
The appearance. Absolutely. Just stick around for a moment, Ronan. Howls to you all out there, and we'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.